So really, once the facts start coming in, it becomes much less of a mystery what might have happened to the dam. Any fair person would conclude that the Ukrainians probably blew it up.
Every conspiracy theory about Ukraine starts somewhere. This one, like most of them, starts with Tucker Carlson. I'm Yulia, an independent political journalist, content creator, and most important of all, a concerned Ukrainian citizen. You're listening to FAQ by Svidomi Media, your friendly neighborhood fact check for Russia's special disinformation operation. Today, we'll break down what really happened to the Kakhovka Dam, as opposed to the frankly ridiculous and offensive claims made by Tucker Carlson that caught the internet in a frenzy of conspiracy theory. Why don't you hear it straight from the horse's mouth?
The Kakhovka Dam was effectively Russian. It was built by the Russian government. It currently sits in Russian-controlled territory. The dam's reservoir supplies water to Crimea, which has been, for the last 240 years, home of the Russian Black Sea Fleet. Blowing up the dam may be bad for Ukraine, but it hurts Russia more. And for precisely that reason, the Ukrainian government has considered destroying it. In December, the Washington Post quoted a Ukrainian general saying his men had fired American-made rockets at the dam's floodgate as a test strike.
You know what? FAQ that. Let's sort this out. On June 6, 2023, the Kakhovka Dam on the Dnipro River experienced a critical failure and collapsed, rapidly draining the Kakhovka reservoir and flooding much of southeastern Ukraine. Because of this, 1.5 million hectares of land in Kherson and Zaporizhia will not be suitable for crops and farming due to irrigation problems, and 150 tons of machine oil has been released into the Dnipro. 48 settlements were flooded, 34 of them in Ukraine-controlled territory, impacting hundreds of thousands of people, and hundreds of species of animals and plants in parts of the Kherson and Mykolaiv regions will also be lost. So what makes Tucker Carlson think that Ukraine would be responsible? Sounds to me like a deliberate lack of context. The river separated 25,000 Russian troops from supplies, with Russia arming and feeding its forces via 3 crossings: the Antonovsky Bridge, the Antonovsky Railway Bridge, and the Kakhovka Dam. Major General Andriy Kovalchuk, the initial commander of the Ukrainian counteroffensive in the Kherson region, said he had considered flooding the Dnipro River in November to slow those Russian supply lines. Both bridges were targeted by US-supplied HIMARS launchers during the Kherson counteroffensive in the fall of 2022, and HIMARS were used in a test strike on one of the dam's floodgates. Quote, making 3 holes in the metal to see if the water level could be raised enough to stymie Russian crossings, but not flood nearby villages, end quote, according to Kovalchuk. Kovalchuk added that while the test was a success, this remained a last resort, and he held off. This is substantially different from Carlson's claim that the Ukrainian government had considered destroying the dam entirely. Let's break this down even further with the help of today's guest, Adam Ratliff, an engineering educator on social media, also known as the Armchair Engineer.
Hi there, my name is Adam Ratliff. I go by Armchair Engineer on TikTok, and Instagram, and YouTube. I'm a content creator and engineering enthusiast who does fact-based explainer videos about common pieces of infrastructure, specifically dams and hydropower.
Hey Adam, user at CITeam_EN on Twitter says that, quote, we believe that the Kakhovka Dam disaster is probably due to occupiers' criminal negligence. Independent sources confirm discharge regulations stopped since November 22. Satellite imagery shows a gradual deterioration of the dam. More details in English later today, end quote. What do you think about that?
Well, I would say that dams like that usually don't collapse on their own all at once. We have seen dams fall over. We have seen dams get undermined and be swept away. It tends to happen over a period of at least hours, if not days and weeks. For example, there's a dam in some disputed territory in Iraq that over the process of ISIS taking over the area, maintenance wasn't being held up, and there's some real danger of that dam being swept away. Had that happened, we would have watched it unfold over a long, protracted period of time. This dam in Ukraine on the Dnipro River, it was standing the night before, and the next morning it was gone. That doesn't happen on its own. This dam definitely did not collapse on its own. And so, as far as I'm concerned, just looking at the structure, it's obvious that some sort of external force was on the dam. As to who did it, that's a whole other conversation. An airstrike on the dam is possible. It's very unlikely, though, because it would require a lot more individual strikes than you could probably do in a stealth way. Also, an airstrike wouldn't sound like a single bang. An airstrike would sound like the sound of the plane, the sound of the missile, the sound of the impact, then the bang of the dam collapsing. There'd be a lot more there. I mean, look at that drone footage again. This is not a narrow breach. This is like a third of the dam's length, which is probably between 800 and 1,000 feet, that was taken out in one chunk. You couldn't do that with strikes in an efficient way. Another issue is missiles don't work very well underwater. Our surface-to-air missiles, any surface-to-air missile, if it was to hit a body of water, it would tend to bounce. And so you'd have to build something specifically for that purpose, like a torpedo. Again, it's possible. It's just not the most likely scenario. And when you look at the evidence of how the concrete crumbled, it's most consistent with an internal fracture caused by explosives than an external force.
Got it. There were images showing progressive damage to the roadway. Could that have presented a weak spot?
Let me just give you an example. Picture in your head the biggest dam you've ever seen, perhaps Hoover Dam outside of Las Vegas, a very large structure. You could detonate a nuclear weapon near the front of it, and the dam would absorb or reflect it back. It's that strong. But you take that same weapon and detonate it inside the dam, and it turns the whole thing to dust. The question about the dam for me is not weak spots on the outside. It's about access to the inside. You could put an incredible amount of force on the outside of the dam and not achieve your goals. But if you have access to the inside of the dam, it's really up to you to pick the time and the timing of when you want this event to occur. And to me, that's the most suspicious thing of all. Notice that it happened at 2:30 in the morning. When we go to daylight savings time, what time do our clocks adjust to the new time? 2 a.m. It's just universally known, like this is when you do things out of sight when people are most likely to not be paying attention. It's just very suspicious timing.
User at Megatron_Ron on Twitter seems to think that, quote, why did the Ukrainians blow up the dam on the Dnieper? First, to stop a possible Russian offensive on Odessa. It's not possible heavy equipment to cross anymore, end quote. What do you think about that?
So this is what's known as a run-of-the-river dam, meaning that it's not tall enough to really impound a huge reservoir like one of the U.S. dams like Hoover or Grand Coulee. It's not a storage dam. It's a run-of-the-river dam. It's about 100 feet tall, but the difference between the upstream water and the downstream water is really only about 50 or 60 feet. The dam is mostly immersed in water. And so it's got fairly large, broad foundations, and it's solid concrete. You could actually hit one of these things with a cruise missile, and it could maybe penetrate up to 15 or 20 feet of concrete. Well, this thing has 100 feet of concrete. And so it's pretty well anchored there in the water. The deep section in the middle is made out of concrete. The side sections are made out of earth. This thing's been standing since, I believe, 1955. It's very solidly built. The Soviet Union was known for overbuilding their structures during that era. And so there's really no practical reason to think that it was ever in much danger. The way that it collapsed, though, is quite alarming because when you see that first drone shot looking over the channel, there's a section where you don't see any debris at all, nothing sticking out of the water. That means that whatever broke all the way down to the foundation to allow that much water to pass through. That tells me that some sort of fracture happened in a deep foundational area, likely near the lower drainage gallery where they inspect the contact between the concrete and the soil. You could really only do that through internal sabotage. That's not something that would happen from an external force like artillery. And I think it's also worth pointing out in Tucker's monologue, he explicitly said it was built by the Russians, which is not true. It was the Soviet Union that built that dam in the territory of Ukraine. This is a completely different government, a completely different socio-political, it was a different landscape back then. And so to say it's, to phrase it as Russia versus Ukraine from that era, that's an inaccurate framing of the situation.
So-called tankies on the internet, or, in layman's terms, lovers of the Soviet Union who have never lived there or know anyone who did, love to attribute all of the positives that happened during Soviet Union to Russia did that. However, only the positives. When it comes to the negatives, of course, it was the Soviet Union. How about this one? User @CharlesRay1 on Twitter seems to think that, quote, "Did Russia blow it up? It doesn't look like it. Images from this morning show the damage fairly close up. There are no indications of demolition or explosives at the point of failure. There are clear signs of structural collapse of the dam facilities." End quote. Would you like to educate them, Adam?
Well, erosion is the enemy of every dam, and every dam suffers from seepage. That's a very real thing. It's not a question of if a dam leaks, it's how much and doesn't matter. And so I can say for certain, though, that in a concrete dam, if you have water going over the top, it's not eroding in the same way that would destroy a dam later on. The kind of erosion that you need to worry about with a concrete dam is undermining underneath. And so if someone's looking at a satellite photo saying, look, water's going over the top of the dam, that's not the erosion that knocks over a dam. If anything, it means there's a spillway gate that's leaking, or maybe the reservoir is at a high elevation and it's exceeded the splashboards at the top of the weir. Like, there's plenty of explanations for water going over the top of a concrete structure like this that have nothing to do with the structural integrity of the dam. If erosion was an issue on this dam that failed, you would have seen evidence of it in the weeks leading up to it, in the form of high turbidity in the water, right? Muddy flows coming up. You would have seen kind of this awkward, uneven boiling of sediment coming up on the downstream side. We've actually seen this in dams around the country pre-failure. Like, this is a real thing that has happened, and it never happens quickly. And then meanwhile, you would watch the dams slowly start to deform and maybe slump down in the channel a little bit. There's no evidence of any of that happening. None of the CCTV footage, none of the satellites, none of the just eyewitness accounts show this dam slumping down into the channel in the days leading up to the failure. So I would say that there's no possible way that erosion could be to blame.
If the dam hypothetically was to collapse on itself, what kind of a noise would locals hear as it was happening?
Ooh, that's a good question. It would definitely not sound like an explosion at a quarry or the sound of shelling. It wouldn't sound anything like that. You would probably hear a sharp crack as a concrete piece broke. But I mean, it's hard to answer that, because what we saw happen with Kakhovka Dam was so complete. Like, an enormous section of the dam failed all at once. There isn't really a failure mechanism in the real world for that to happen on its own. Like, I could imagine a spillway gate breaking. That would sound like a car crash. That would sound like twisted metal. I could imagine one of the spillway weirs cracking and overturning. I had that happen to a dam here in the Pacific Northwest. They caught it before it failed. That would also be loud, but so much smaller than what we actually saw. What we saw is, it doesn't really fit into any category of natural collapse for a dam. And so to imagine what it would sound like, that sound shouldn't exist.
This next one is probably my favorite question of all. User DOHELU on Twitter says that, quote, "With drowned defenses and eventually former fertile land and Crimea getting no more water, the dam being blown up hurts Russian troops and Ukrainian Russian speakers living under Russia's control more than Ukraine's side of the river. So why would Russia blow up the dam?" End quote.
Absolutely. So a lot of the attention in the media has been on the immediate effects of the loss of the dam, mainly the flooding downstream. And so even though the dam only impounds 50 or so feet of water, that's still a lot of acre feet of water that ends up in a relatively flat floodplain, which means a lot of buildings damaged, people's homes underwater, cropland lost. It's very sad, but honestly, that's pretty short term. The water is going to recede in the next few days, and people will start to dig out. The long-term consequences are much more serious. This is the lowest dam on the Dnipro River, which is such a key link in this part of the country, connecting the Black Sea up into the interior of Ukraine. And it was the equivalent of the Mississippi in the United States, or the Columbia River on the West Coast. And so this is the lowest dam on that vital link, which means the shipping channel is now damaged. You may not be able to get the traffic through that you were expecting to. It's a loss of hydropower, which is very important all the time, especially in light of climate, but even more so during wartime. It's a loss of water source for some of the upstream intakes on irrigation canals, drinking water canals, even the nuclear power station, which fortunately has a closed loop system, so there's no imminent threat. But at some point, they're going to need fresh water again. And so it's going to take, if they started today, it would probably be a 4-year process to replace the dam. In the meantime, they're going to have to do a lot of work to mitigate some of those losses. We're talking about pumps, we're talking about facilities being moved and rebuilt, and some industries just not being able to function. The long-term consequences of this are staggering. It's the kind of facility that whoever owns and rules this part of the world, it doesn't matter who it is, someone's going to have to rebuild that dam. And it's going to be a real expensive, difficult process. And so in my mind, that puts to bed any notion that the Ukrainians did this to themselves, because whoever did this sabotage clearly does not plan on being around to clean up the mess. My heart goes out to the people who live in this area, because this should never have happened. This is a piece of infrastructure that should have gone for another 100 years, just helping this region function. We don't actually know how long a dam like that should last. With proper maintenance, it should be measured in centuries. What we're finding is some dams are becoming obsolete before they fall apart. That's not the case with this dam. This is a dam on a major river that has serious industrial application. It needs to be rebuilt. And the design that was there before probably could have lasted to, the 2200s if it was maintained properly. And not only are they going to have to deal with the flood risks or the flood mitigation, they're going to have to rebuild that dam. And that's going to take years and cost probably around $10 billion, somewhere in there.
But what about Crimea? Isn't it bad for the peninsula too?
Oh, drop in the bucket compared to all those other regions that have now lost significantly because of the loss of the dam. Yeah, Crimea is at the bottom of the list of who's going to suffer because of this dam. Crimea is in an interesting spot geographically. The way it's surrounded on 3 sides by water makes it strategically important, but the land itself is not particularly great. It's not agricultural like you find further up into Ukraine. It's mostly about its strategic spot on the Black Sea and the ports. And so their water needs aren't as large as many people think. And if you have a couple ships parked offshore and you have desalination going, you could probably get by. There's going to be a lot of rationing. It's not going to be good. But Crimea, this isn't a make or break thing for Crimea. They're going to be able to find water. They have wells. They have other means of bringing water in. This notion to me that it couldn't have been Russia because they wouldn't do this to Crimea honestly feels a little bit like a lame argument. It's like saying there's no way that bin Laden could have done 9/11 because that there were Muslims who worked in Manhattan. It's like, well, hold on. Like, that's such a small thing compared to the big thing, right? The restoring water to Crimea, it will be expensive, but they'll get it done. The much bigger user of water is the agriculture. The agricultural canals that come out of the lake further north. That's going to be the much bigger project. I'm not too worried about Crimea finding drinking water.
I've got one more here for you, but let me give some context to the audience first. In August 1941, the Soviet troops retreating under the forces of Nazi Germany blew up the Dnipro HPP dam. A huge wave of water covered the lower part of Khortytsa and the southern parts of the city. The explosion was organized at the direction of the NKVD by the Red Army Boris Epov and Alexei Petrovsky. To undermine the dam, 20 tons of explosives were laid, which were delivered from Moscow by 2 planes. This was done in order to stop the German offensive. Does that ring a bell? However, it didn't put a stop to it. It merely slowed it down a little. What it did do, though, according to various sources, then from 20 to 100,000 people died. The flow reached the cities of Manganese and Nikopol, located almost 80 kilometers downstream of the Dnipro.
So in World War II, there were, on several different fronts, there were attempts to disable dams in an attempt to hurt the German war machine. And the United States invented a new technique for destroying Nazi dams in the form of these bombs that would skip off of the water. Because the problem is, if you blow up a dam at the top, you just blew up the top part and maybe only lost a few feet of its storage. Really, you want to get down to the bottom. And so they invented a bomb that could skip across the water, hit the back of the dam and not explode, and then it would sink to a depth and then blow up there. And it was enormously successful. It appears that this dam in Ukraine back in the early 40s was demolished in a similar form, except they probably didn't need to use aircraft bombs. They probably just threw explosives over the back of the dam and just let it happen directly. Fortunately, they didn't go as deep as they should have, but this looks like it caused an enormous amount of damage. That's a huge amount of water that was let out, from what I'm seeing from this picture. And I can only imagine the agriculture disruption that happened as a result. It's really a horrifying strategy, a scorched earth strategy. And it's really a shame that it's being brought back.
So I wanted to ask you to compare and contrast these two events, since Russia has already set the precedent by blowing up a dam in the past.
I would say they differ in one very key area. The dam in 1941, it does not appear that it was blown up from the inside. This looks like it was blown up from the upstream face. They likely had soldiers walk across the top of the dam, have timed explosives that lower down by ropes, and then count to 10 or whatever, and it blows up. This does not look like it was done from the inside, whereas the dam that was blown up this week obviously was done from the inside. The other difference is the dam that was blown up recently was quite a bit shorter than the dam in 1941. This one in 1941 looks to be about 2 to 2.5 times taller, and so the impact was probably far worse back then. So those are two critical differences, but I mean, the strategy behind it is basically the same. And I think it's important to understand the differences in scale here. Part of the reason why the Kakhovka Dam is basically erased from the river channel is because it was significantly shorter than this dam in 1941. And so there was less to blow up, there's less there, and the water was able to do the rest. The damage to the dam and also what's left over, it's very telling, because half of the spillway structure is still intact in the channel, like not cracked at all. And then the powerhouse is completely obliterated, but still anchored in the channel. So that tells me exactly where they started the explosives and where they ended. There's no other explanation for it. Any natural failure would have been much smaller and much more localized. To have half the spillway and all of the powerhouse broken in that way, the only explanation is through internal explosives.
And that'll be it from our guests today. If you'd like to learn more information about the Kakhovka Dam, check out the resources linked in the description of the podcast below. Join me in the next episode as we continue to bring facts to the battlefield of Russia's special disinformation operation. And in the meanwhile, if you'd like to be filled in daily on everything that happens in Ukraine, as well as hear some sassy responses to Russian trolls, don't forget to follow me on YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram at YEWLEEA. And if you want to learn more about dams and bridges, please extend that same courtesy to Adam at Armchair Engineer on TikTok, YouTube, and Instagram, also linked in the description of the podcast. Well, so long, folks, and FAQU, Russia and your special disinformation operation.